It was just another typical stormy October afternoon at Hillcrest High, a day when the sky seemed to hang heavy with the promise of something unspeakable. Dark clouds loomed ominously overhead, a storm brewing both inside and outside the school. The wind howled through the trees surrounding the building, its force strong enough to rattle the windows, sending sharp, eerie noises into the otherwise quiet school hallways. The rain came in sheets, slapping against the glass in a rhythm that mimicked a drumbeat, like nature itself was preparing for something. Inside, the school buzzed with its usual midday hum. Students scattered throughout the cafeteria, their voices a familiar melody of laughter and chatter. Their worlds seemed as normal as they always did at lunch. Groups huddled in corners, recounting their morning classes, gossiping about the latest rumors, and joking about the weekend ahead. Everyone's voices blended into a cacophony of youthful energy. It was in these moments, as students casually debated the best cafeteria pizza toppings or discussed who might be dating who, that the atmosphere inside seemed almost serene, almost safe. The usual tumultuous life of high school, filled with exams and crushes, worries over grades, and fleeting friendships, gave way to a sense of peace. For many, the storm outside was the most dangerous thing that could interrupt their afternoon. But the calm was shattered in an instant, and peace turned to chaos. A sharp, sudden noise rang through the air. A series of gunshots so loud, so unexpected, that they cut through the cafeteria's noise with surgical precision. The first shot was a brutal surprise, piercing the calm like a dagger. The second followed in quick succession, louder and more terrifying. The room froze. For a brief second, the world outside the cafeteria seemed to vanish entirely. In that suffocating silence, the students were paralyzed. No one understood what had just happened. No one could quite grasp the implications of those deafening cracks in the air. What was that? A joke? A drill? A mistake? The uncertainty held everyone in a vice-like grip. Then, the third shot echoed through the hall, a sickening reminder that something real, something horrific, was unfolding right outside the walls. Panic spread like wildfire. Without thinking, some students dropped to the floor, their bodies instinctively seeking cover. Others scrambled under tables or ducked behind the closest objects. The once carefree chatter was replaced by the pounding of feet, the scraping of chairs as they were hastily shoved aside, and the frantic whispers that spread like wildfire. What was happening? Was it real? Where is it coming from? In a blur, everything went from normal to life-threatening. The smooth, mundane rhythms of lunch had turned into survival instincts taking over. The food on the tables was forgotten, the laughter silenced, and the bright fluorescent lights now felt harsh and alien, almost too bright for the creeping dread that filled the space. The cafeteria, which had always been a gathering place for students to escape the stresses of the day, had instantly transformed into a trap, a cage of fear. Teachers, too, were caught off guard. Their initial confusion reflected in the wide eyes of the few staff members who had managed to enter the lunchroom at that moment. Their hands fumbled with walkie-talkies, trying to make sense of the unfolding nightmare, and their voices cracked as they barked orders. Stay down. Get away from the windows. Lock the doors. But their words barely registered in the students' ears as fear overtook them. Their minds scrambled for answers. Is this a shooting? What are we supposed to do? What is happening? The natural instinct to stay close to the walls, the urge to run, the desire to protect themselves and those around them, all these impulses collided in their young minds. Outside the cafeteria, the sounds of chaos escalated. The sirens of distant police cars began to wail, their shrill voices cutting through the otherwise quiet streets. More shots rang out, farther away but still close enough to make the walls tremble. The air felt thick with fear and uncertainty. Every single person inside the school, every teacher, every student, had been thrust into a nightmare that no one had prepared for. At that moment, the school's once familiar hallways became a labyrinth of fear. And yet, No one knew what was really happening. No one knew who was responsible. No one knew if the shots would stop or escalate. Every second that passed without an explanation only deepened the terror that gripped everyone in the building. The intercom crackled to life, its tone mechanical and distant. "This is a lockdown. Lock all doors. Stay in your classrooms and remain quiet. No one is to leave the building. Stay safe." The words came in a rushed monotone, as though even the person delivering the message was trying to maintain a calm in the midst of their own panic. But those words, though meant to offer a sense of control, only served to heighten the fear. Stay safe, but how? There were no answers, no clear instructions. The storm outside raged on, relentless and wild. And inside, the storm was only just beginning. Some students, still huddled under tables or pressed against the walls, could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. The adrenaline coursing through their veins made every breath feel shallow and urgent. Others, unable to remain still, began to move. Some toward the nearest exit, some unsure where to go, some simply reacting without thinking. The teachers, trying desperately to maintain some form of order, shouted to the students to stay calm. But their own voices wavered, betraying the fear they too were trying to contain. This was no drill. This was real. And that simple, undeniable truth hung in the air like a heavy fog, choking any hope of clarity. The lunch period, once a moment of escape, had become a moment of sheer terror, and no one knew when or if it would end. As the gunshots finally faded into an eerie silence, an almost unbearable stillness settled over Hillcrest High. The chaos that had erupted moments ago felt like it had come from another world, one where reality was bent out of shape and the rules of normalcy had been shredded. In their wake, an unsettling calm swept through the school, but it was the kind of silence that felt like the eye of a storm, too quiet, too heavy with uncertainty, the kind that made every heartbeat feel louder, every breath more fragile. The intercom crackled again, this time with an urgency that pierced the tension in the air. "This is a lockdown. Lock all doors immediately. Remain in your rooms. Stay away from windows. Do not leave the building." The words were cold, devoid of the usual calm professionalism. They sounded like an order, but one that offered no comfort, just cold, mechanical instructions. Within seconds, the staff sprang into action, but their movements were rushed, panicked, as they tried to corral the students to safety. It was a scene of organized chaos. Teachers barked commands, pushing students into the nearest classrooms, shouting orders to lock doors, draw blinds, and turn off the lights. But there was no escape from the heavy weight of fear that filled the building. In the middle of the madness, the students were herded toward the multipurpose room, the designated safe zone. Some of them stumbled, unsure whether they were moving in the right direction, their legs unsteady, minds racing with questions that had no answers. The air was thick with confusion and terror. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with the kind of fear that made it hard to breathe. The group was silent, their whispers barely audible, as if speaking too loud might summon some new, unknown terror. As they shuffled into the multipurpose room, it became clear. This was no longer a school. The multipurpose room, a place where students usually played sports, attended assemblies, or held fundraisers, now felt like a sanctuary, fragile and temporary, but their only option in the face of the unknown. The stark fluorescent lights above flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The teachers closed the door behind them, locking it with trembling hands, the sound of the bolt echoing in the silence. For a few moments, no one spoke. Everyone just stood, frozen, unsure of what to do next. Some students sat on the floor, knees pulled to their chests, their faces buried in their hands, while others paced the room, too restless to stay still. The weight of the situation pressed on their chests, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. They were trapped, and they knew it. Outside, the chaos that had started with the gunshots had only escalated. The air outside was thick with sirens, the wail of police vehicles cutting through the heavy downpour. There was no way to tell how far away the authorities were, or if they would even be able to reach the school in time. The rain was coming down harder now, like a wall of water crashing against the windows, masking the sound of everything happening outside. Through the thin walls of the multi-purpose room, the students could hear the occasional shout from the hallways. Muffled voices, urgent, but impossible to understand. The sense of isolation grew with every passing minute. The distance between them and whatever was happening outside seemed to stretch further, like a chasm they could not cross. Then, the truth hit them all at once. This wasn't just a random act of violence. They weren't caught in the middle of a robbery gone wrong or a fight that had spiraled out of control. No, this was something much darker. It wasn't just the gunshots that had shattered the peace. It was the man behind them. The police scanner, which had crackled intermittently with fragmented updates, finally revealed the chilling details. A man, mentally unstable and seemingly desperate, had barricaded himself near the school entrance. The weight of those words hit the students like a ton of bricks. A man. Not just any man, but someone with a purpose, someone who had made a conscious decision to hold them captive. He had armed himself, his rage and fear now a weapon against anyone who dared come close. But it wasn't just the presence of the man that made the situation so chilling. It was the nature of his threats. He would kill anyone who tried to approach. His voice had been captured over the radio, ragged and filled with paranoia. There was no negotiating with him. There were no demands or requests. There was just one thing: violence. The weight of that knowledge sank in deeply. The students could no longer pretend they were just waiting for things to calm down. This was real. The school was under siege. The man was out there, his mental state unraveling, and they were trapped in here, in the dark, waiting for something they couldn't predict. For those in the multi-purpose room, the uncertainty was the most terrifying part. What did he want? Why had he chosen this place? What were his next steps? The questions swirled in their minds, mixing with the fear that tightened in their throats. But the one thing that consumed every thought was the primal instinct for survival. They couldn't escape, and they didn't know if anyone would come for them. The uncertainty made their minds race even faster. Would the man come inside? Would he turn his attention to them? Was anyone out there able to stop him? They were trapped in a surreal nightmare, with nothing but silence and the pounding of their own hearts to remind them they were alive. Every minute stretched on endlessly, the seconds dragging as they waited for something, anything, to break the stillness. Some students whispered to one another, trying to comfort each other with the illusion that everything would be okay. But even the most reassuring words couldn't hide the truth. They were stuck, unsure if they would ever be able to leave this room alive. Outside, the man's presence loomed like a shadow. The weight of his mental instability was palpable. It was clear now that he wasn't just a threat. They were caught in the grip of someone who had lost all sense of reason, someone who would stop at nothing to make sure their terror became his own twisted version of control. And inside the multi-purpose room, the question lingered in the air like smoke. How long would they have to wait? As the minutes bled into hours, the silence outside grew heavier, darker. It was the kind of quiet that filled your ears with a pressure that felt like it might explode at any moment. Time stretched out, and they all knew. It was a waiting game now. Hours dragged on, stretching into an agonizing eternity, yet the lockdown held. The multi-purpose room, once filled with the clatter of students moving through their lunch hour, had become a suffocating prison. The windows, once sources of light and views of the outside world, were now mere barriers, offering nothing but a glimpse into the impenetrable dark. Outside, the storm raged on. Rain continued to slam against the glass, lightning flashing in intervals, casting eerie, jagged shadows across the walls. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that churned inside the room. The students huddled together in small groups, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. There was no way to know if anyone had called the police, or if the man outside was even still out there. Every small sound, every creak of the door, every shift in the darkness made their hearts race with the thought that he could break in at any moment. The uncertainty gnawed at them, relentless and suffocating. Some sat on the cold floor, knees drawn up to their chests, their hands pressed to their faces as if to block out the panic that flooded their thoughts. Others stood against the walls, trying to make themselves as small as possible, as though hiding might somehow make them invisible. The hours passed in a haze of confusion, with no word from the outside world. The students whispered to each other, their voices barely audible above the pounding of their own hearts. "What if he comes in?" one student asked, her voice trembling. "What if we're next?" No one had an answer. The teachers, too, were silent, their faces strained with anxiety. They had no idea what was happening outside, no way to contact anyone for help. They, too, were trapped in this waiting game, their own fear mirroring that of the students they had sworn to protect. The strain of being locked in that room, unsure of their fate, began to take its toll. Every student seemed to retreat into their own head, trying to process what had happened, what was happening. The tension was unbearable. Time had lost its meaning. And then, as if the dark cloud that hung over them couldn't get any thicker, the truth finally emerged. It came not from the outside world, but from the very heart of their own school. A voice, calm yet shaken, came through the loudspeakers. "Attention, students, attention. We've just received additional information. The man outside, he's not a stranger. He's not just some random person off the street." The room went still. The tension grew, heavier now, as the students strained to hear the rest of the announcement. No one dared breathe. Everyone's eyes were locked on the speaker, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. "This man, he has a criminal history. He's a registered sex offender. He's been in and out of the system for years, and his past is filled with violence. The situation we're facing today is more dangerous than we could have imagined." The words landed like a blow. The revelation sent a wave of shock through the room, followed by an almost suffocating silence. The students, who had been grappling with the unknown, were now faced with an even darker truth. This wasn't just some isolated act of rage or a random incident gone horribly wrong. This man was someone with a past steeped in violence and criminal behavior, a man who had been allowed to walk freely, only for the school to now find itself at his mercy. As the gravity of the situation settled in, the weight of the man's past seemed to swallow everything else. He was not a stranger to the system. He was a product of it, someone who had slipped through the cracks time and again. The fact that he was now standing outside their doors, threatening them with his madness, was not just terrifying. It was infuriating. The students were trapped in a nightmare created by a system that had failed to keep them safe. The horror wasn't just in the immediate danger the man posed. It was in the realization that this wasn't just about survival. It was about the trust that had been shattered. The school, a place meant to be a safe haven, had been infiltrated by someone who had a long, twisted history of inflicting harm. The students' world, once familiar and predictable, had been irreparably changed. Some of the students began to sob, unable to contain the overwhelming emotions that flooded them. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds reeling from the horrifying new details. The teacher who had been so focused on keeping everyone calm now stood in the corner of the room, her face pale, as if she, too, was trying to absorb the magnitude of what they were facing. It was clear this was no longer just about the man outside with a gun. It was about the systems that allowed him to be here in the first place. The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the room. "A sex offender?" one student asked, her voice raw. "How is he here?" Another shook their head, unable to process the full extent of what was unfolding. Why didn't anyone know? The questions came fast, but no one had answers. The police, who had been scrambling to take control of the situation outside, had their hands tied, trying to piece together the details as they desperately worked to neutralize the threat. But for the students inside, the knowledge that they had been targeted by someone with such a violent past was almost too much to bear. The tension in the room shifted from fear of immediate harm to a gnawing, paralyzing sense of betrayal. How could this have happened? How could the school have failed them in this way? The familiar hallways they had walked down every day, the classrooms where they had studied, the places that had once felt like home, had all been turned into a death trap by someone who had no business being there. The reality of their situation began to take on an even darker edge. The thoughts that had lingered in the back of their minds, that they might never leave this room alive, seemed closer to becoming a grim truth. The fear wasn't just about being hurt. It was about being at the mercy of someone who had no qualms about destroying lives. Outside, the sirens wailed louder, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The sound of helicopters could be heard faintly overhead, their rotors thundering through the air, but it felt like an eternity before help could even begin to arrive. But for the students inside, the terror was just beginning. The man outside wasn't just a threat. They were trapped in the grip of a nightmare that had only begun to unfold, and there was no way of knowing how far it would go or how long they would have to wait in that room, in the darkness, wondering if they would ever see daylight again.